So I shall hand over to Pauline Norstrom, who will outline the legal and ethical guidelines for the use of automated facial recognition. And Pauline Norstrom, you're the founder and CEO of Anikanta Consulting, honorary member of the British Security Industry Association, which is our member from the UK. And Anikanta Consulting is a strategic advisory company specialized in the application of AI and innovation for security and related industries. Your background is in leading video surveillance analytics technology, and you've been previously holding various corporate board and leadership roles in international security product manufacturing companies. I won't go through your whole profile and just give the floor to you now, Pauline. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, first and foremost, I'd just like to thank CoESS for the invitation to invite BSIA to present their guide, and that is myself doing that. What I'm going to talk about is the journey of the guide, but also the backdrop as to why we felt it was necessary to take action and be proactive before any of the proposed legislation in Europe emerged. There was concern, so I'll walk through that. So next slide, please, Alex. So for those who don't know about the BSIA, it is the trade association for the professional security industry in the UK, and the members range in size from global companies to small and medium enterprises. And more than 70% of privately provided UK security products and services in the UK are from BSIA companies. And those range from manufacture, distribution, and installation of electronic and physical security equipment, and the provision of security guarding and consultancy services. The mission is to foster collaborative domestic and international relationships with governments, BSI, Euralarm, and in particular, BSIA is a founder member of CoESS, and there is a strong CoESS engagement on AI, on automated facial recognition, AFR, cybersecurity training and monitoring centres. BSIA leads the UK industry through engagement, representation and creation of guidance, training and codes of practice from security monitoring, installation and through to privacy masking. So next slide, please, Alex. So maybe a little bit of a backdrop here. Why is automated facial recognition actually in the spotlight? It is an AI-based technology. And I thought I'd give a little bit of an explanation of some of the concerns in the UK. There are certainly many different applications, and it can be very beneficial, highly beneficial technology if it's used correctly. But there is scope for it to be misused in a way which may infringe upon human rights, and we are obviously very concerned about that. The public in the UK expressed fear of the technology if used without controls. And we felt as an association we needed to explain and to show that its ethical use is in the hands of a responsible and professional industry. And by producing the guide, we would like to build trust by leading the way and ultimately avoid a ban on the use of the technology. We feel that the guide champions best use through straightforward, non-technical guidance to its legal and ethical use. Thanks, Alex. Next slide. When we started on this journey, there were certainly uncertain times, and this is probably a good example of leadership in uncertain times, as we're all familiar with now with the COVID crisis. We don't know what's coming next. But at the time, public trust in the use of AFR in public spaces was quite low, and this was 2019. The media and liberty groups were expressing substantial concerns about the UK moving towards a dystopian society where the state controlled everything. There was proposed UK legislation which called for a total moratorium on the use of AFR in all public spaces, regardless of whether they were publicly owned or whether they were private spaces. And then a substantial test case emerged, which was Liberty International versus South Wales Police, whereby the use of AFR in public spaces was substantially challenged, and that went through to judgment and then an appeal and then further clarity. But shortcomings were identified, and those were sufficient to create concern about the use of this technology. Those shortcomings, by the way, were not related to bias in the technology, which is one of the issues that comes out frequently in the media. It was more about process, about the data protection impact assessments. Where AFR is concerned, the UK GDPR legislation, which is based on the European GDPR, it is difficult, and there are no ethical standards guiding the applications. But the pandemic raised the awareness of the benefits of contactless technology, and AFR activated access control is a really good example, whereby spaces can be made safe. People don't have to actually make physical contact with entry systems through the use of this technology. So there was real concern, given that the pandemic required contactless spaces, that a ban on the AFR would be detrimental. So we felt that we anticipated the needs, we were proactive and created a guide to its legal and ethical use against a real backdrop of uncertainty. We didn't know whether the government would legislate or what would happen, but it seemed like a good decision to actually take action and lay this out and make a start. Next slide, please, Alex. So here is a journey. It's a journey about collaborative working and how the association brings together its members and its expertise and joins that expertise to create a result. So the journey starting on the left, the concerns. So 2 years ago, there could have been a ban in all public places. BSIA made the decision to develop a guide at the beginning of 2020 and formed a working group which was diverse. It included AFR developers, also installers and other providers of technology, and my company. And we commenced work on this guide, and we worked together on that. During the process, the South Wales Police judgment emerged in August 2020, and we talked about what should we do. The view was that UK government would probably do something, and actually some very good guidance regarding police use emerged from the Surveillance Camera Commissioner at the time, but that came later. So we still felt that it was very important to guide the private security industry. And we worked together, the members worked together on the group for 6 months. And that resulted in our document, which went out to a UK and international stakeholder consultation. We received excellent feedback, universally accepted as a good thing to do, and a first of its kind, leading to its release in February 2021. Next slide, please, Alex. So I'm going to talk through some of the key areas addressed in the guide to give you a flavour of what it is we're actually advising. And the focus is very much on an upfront assessment of the needs. It's a very robust process. And here are some of the steps. So first and foremost, to define why AFR is needed, to define clearly where it's going to be used and the purpose of its use. And at the centre of this assessment is the ethical aspect. Alongside the DPIA, the data protection impact assessment, any mitigation of risks, and also to ensure necessity and proportionality. And these are all in accordance with the GDPR requirements. So next slide, please, Alex. A little bit more about the ethical principles. So the ethics at the foundations of the guide are based on OECD guidelines and the EU ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. As a reminder as to what those are, because they are woven through the guide, This involves human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. And the legal framework was drawn from the UK GDPR and UK's ICO framework for privacy and data protection impact assessments. And the guide states very clearly that only if the ethical and legal principles are satisfied should the deployment go ahead. Next slide, please. We have laid out very clear governance and compliance responsibilities, and they are to ensure that there's accountability, responsibility, and considerations towards privacy and data protection. And some examples from the guide under accountability: to ensure that an individual or group is nominated and held accountable for the ethical and legal compliance and the operation of the system. To ensure that there is an ethical and lawful basis for processing, which includes considering whether consent is given, whether there's a legitimate interest. To ensure the integrity of the data is protected based on the risk of the processing. For responsibility, we encourage that individuals and processing systems have defined and documented responsibilities and appropriate authorization levels, that policies are shared and approved at a strategic or board level in the organisation that is using the technology, and to ensure that all processing activities are defined and documented. And in the privacy section, we encourage that appropriate privacy data is made available for subject access requests, to ensure all data collected is necessary, proportionate, and stored for an appropriate amount of time and in a transparent manner. To ensure a suitable data protection policy is available and published if that's appropriate to do so. And most of all, to ensure that a data protection impact assessment is undertaken. Next slide, please, Alex. We've explained how AFR works to make it really clear, and we've created some really nice flow diagrams, which I'll show you in the subsequent slides. But there are 3 steps involved in the process. The image of the subject is captured and a facial map is created. Also, a reference database is created of facial maps provided through enrolment, so an authorised list of people who have access, or indeed a watch list in the case of law enforcement. For the application, during the actual use case, a comparison is made between the image and the facial map captured, that's the person that presents themselves to the system, and the facial map that is held on the database. And then the next step is the decision. And this is the process through which it's decided whether that person is authenticated, and whether that happens as a result of human interaction, whether further action needs to be taken or nothing at all. Next slide, please, Alex. So when discussing the organisation and structure of the guide, we felt there were 2 very distinct use case scenarios. The first being determining, is it you? So to verify whether that individual should be there. And we feel this sits under the GDPR, Article 9, which is the special category data processing, biometric-based verification. And this could be access control, for example. And the second distinct group is determining who is it, when you don't necessarily expect that person to be there. It might be a crowd. This is identification. We feel this now sits in the remote biometric identification section of the new EU regulation and is classified as high-risk AI. Next slide, please, Alex. So I've extracted the flow diagram from the guide, which explains in a step process, the verification process. In both cases, the capture process is actually the same, in that an image is captured, facial map created. And it is the makeup of the reference database and how that's used that really makes a distinction between these applications. So let's say a person presents himself to an access control gate. A comparison is made between their face, their facial map, and the list of allowed people. If there's a match, the gate opens. If it's a maybe, we're not sure, a human is in the loop to check, have a look, verify, and allow access. If there's no match, then no access. But it's recommended there's another means of people getting through if, let's say, the system isn't able to match them. We've given some examples which may help to relate. I've mentioned access control, which is highly beneficial in contactless environments, but it could be used and is used to manage the flow of individuals into restricted areas to gain access, for time and attendance applications, for fire evacuation safety, and personal access to mobile phones, computers and online banking. That's become accepted that Face ID will authenticate a payment, for border control to allow passage of people into or leaving the country. So next slide, please, Alex. So the more contentious area is identification. Who is it? And you'll see the capture process. It looks the same, but the difference here is in the way it's used. So we acknowledge that if you are using this technology to identify people who you don't expect to be in the scene, they are not necessarily presenting themselves directly facing the camera. It's more difficult for the system to actually recognise the face. And in every case here, we say a human should be in the loop. So even if there's a match, that should be verified by a human. If it's a maybe, should be verified by a human. And if there's no match, you don't take any action. And this is a really important extra step in this process, which I believe actually is now embedded in the new legislation. So it's encouraging we were thinking in the right way at that time without this legislation having been released. So we see this as remote biometric identification and sits in the high-risk AI category. And examples would be border control, but not at the gates, to look at the crowds, okay, crowds of people queuing to identify persons on a known or approved watch list. For use in private venues by the owners of those venues, it might be shops, museums, stadiums, leisure centres, where there's a need to control theft or antisocial behaviour. Law enforcement is an obvious use case to alert the presence of individuals of interest, private securities companies and shopping centres and local authorities to alert the presence of individuals of interest. For retrospective search of video by law enforcement once the video has been recorded, and also potentially the inclusion onto a private watch list to alert business owners of a person of interest, such as in retail. So next slide, please, Alex. So also included in the guide is a set of guidance relating to privacy, storage, and the reference database or watch list. And starting with the reference database, we provide guidance on its purpose to ensure that there is strong quality control, that the cybersecurity measures are in place, and it's possible to fulfil subject access requests. The storage and retention. The retention time is considered. The storage has to be secure, and there need to be appropriate data sharing agreements in place between the parties. For data privacy, the data protection impact assessment is at the heart of everything we do in this guide. The processing has to be necessary and proportionate, suitable signage to advise people that the technology is in use, that consent is given by those people, and that privacy masking is used if appropriate. So next slide, please, Alex. So in summary, the guide requires strict legal and ethical considerations for every case. There's clear guidance on governance and responsibility. Privacy and data impact assessments are at the heart of the guide, and consent is woven in. Concerns around bias are addressed, and distinct use cases are defined, drawing that distinction between verification and identification, and we give examples. And the role of the human in the decision loop is also defined to make this clearer. When would you have someone check? Now, the next steps for the guide. The BSIA have formed and continued to run a special interest group which continues to discuss this matter and aligns with UK and EU regulation implications. And we see the guide's roadmap, including the potential for the future production of a BSIA code of practice. So I hope you found that useful and interesting, not too technical. It is a practical guide. And I'd just like to thank you once again. It's been an absolute pleasure presenting this guide to you today.